The suitcase was already packed before anyone told me to leave. I am Emily Carter, and the moment I saw that navy blue suitcase standing beside the front door, I realized this family dinner was never meant to be a conversation. It was a decision that had already been made. The dining room smelled like roasted chicken and fresh bread. The same meals we shared every Sunday. The same table where I had spent 6 years helping this family celebrate birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays. Yet that evening felt different. Nobody was smiling. Nobody was making small talk. Even the ticking wall clock seemed louder than usual. My husband Ryan sat across from me, staring down at his plate. His mother, Margaret Carter, sat at the head of the table with her hands folded tightly together. His father Nathan looked exhausted, and Ryan's older sister Linda watched me with an expression I could not quite read. I had spent years trying to earn Linda's approval, years trying to prove I belonged in this family. Apparently none of it mattered. "Emily," Margaret finally said, breaking the silence. "There is something we need to discuss." My stomach tightened immediately. The room felt colder. I glanced at Ryan, expecting him to look at me. He did not. Instead, he kept staring at the table. That was when I knew whatever was about to happen was serious. Linda cleared her throat dramatically. "The missing money from the family business account has become impossible to ignore." I blinked in confusion. "What missing money?" Linda slid a folder across the table. "Several $1,000s cannot be accounted for." I looked from the folder to her face. "And you think I took it?" Nobody answered right away. That silence hurt more than any accusation. Margaret finally spoke. "The records suggest you had access." I felt my chest tighten. "Many people had access." Linda shook her head. "Not like you." I turned toward Ryan. "Say something." For a second I thought he would. I thought he would stand up and tell everyone how ridiculous this was. Instead, he rubbed his forehead and quietly said, "Maybe it would be best if everyone had some space." Space. Such a harmless word. Yet it shattered something inside me. I looked around the table at people I had cooked for, cared for, and supported during difficult times. Nobody defended me. Nobody asked for proof. Nobody even looked uncomfortable. It was as though they had rehearsed this moment long before I arrived. Then Margaret stood and pointed toward the front door. "Emily, perhaps it would be better if you stayed somewhere else for a while." Somewhere else. Another gentle phrase hiding a cruel reality. My eyes drifted toward the suitcase waiting by the entrance. They had packed it already. My clothes. My belongings. My life. They had prepared everything before giving me a chance to speak. I stood slowly. My hands were shaking, but I refused to cry. Not there. Not in front of people who had already decided who I was. "So this is it?" I asked quietly. Nathan lowered his eyes. Ryan remained silent. Linda folded her arms. Margaret looked away. That was my answer. I walked toward the front door and grabbed the suitcase handle. The wheels rolled softly across the hardwood floor. Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed me. Nobody said they were sorry. Outside, a cold rain had started falling across the quiet suburban street. I stood on the porch for a moment, staring at the house I had called home for 6 years. The lights glowed warmly through the windows. From the outside, it looked like a perfect family. But I knew better now. As I carried the suitcase down the walkway and into the rain, I believed I was losing everything. What I did not know was that the people inside that house were about to discover exactly what they had thrown away. The first night felt strangely quiet. After checking into a small extended-stay apartment on the other side of town, I sat on the edge of a bed that barely fit inside the room and stared at my suitcase. Everything I owned was packed into a few bags. 6 years of marriage had ended in less than 20 minutes. What hurt most was not being accused. It was how quickly everyone believed it. I kept expecting my phone to ring. I kept expecting Ryan to call and say there had been a mistake. An hour passed, then another. The screen remained dark. Around midnight, I finally accepted the truth. Nobody was coming after me. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. Old habits are difficult to break. For years I had been the first person awake in the Carter household. I made coffee, prepared breakfast, organized schedules, paid bills, ordered supplies for the family business, remembered birthdays, scheduled appointments, handled countless little details nobody noticed because everything always worked. Sitting alone at a tiny kitchen table, I realized something almost funny. Most of the family probably believed their lives would continue exactly as before. They thought I was the problem. They thought removing me would restore peace. They had no idea how many things quietly depended on me. I spent the next few days rebuilding my routine. I updated my resume, contacted former colleagues, organized my finances. The apartment was small, but it was clean and peaceful. For the first time in years, nobody demanded anything from me. Nobody expected me to solve their problems. Nobody blamed me for things beyond my control. The silence felt lonely at first. Then it started to feel liberating. Meanwhile, small cracks were already appearing inside the Carter family. I did not know it yet, but those cracks were growing wider every day. 3 days after I left, a catering order for one of the family business clients was never confirmed. I had always handled those communications. The client became frustrated. Ryan spent half a day trying to fix the misunderstanding. 2 days later, an equipment maintenance appointment was missed because nobody remembered it had been scheduled months earlier. Then a utility payment slipped through the cracks. Then another. Individually, none of these problems seemed serious. Together, they created chaos. The strange thing was that nobody connected the problems to my absence. Not at first. Instead, everyone blamed stress, bad luck, miscommunication, anything except the obvious answer. On the 6th day, I received my first message from Ryan. It was only 4 words long. How are you doing? I stared at the screen for nearly a minute. 6 years together. 1 week after being thrown out. 4 words. No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of what had happened. Just a question. I typed several responses and deleted every one of them. Eventually, I placed the phone face down and walked away. Later that evening, an old friend called with unexpected news. A management position had opened at a local consulting firm. The salary was better than anything I had earned before. The opportunity seemed almost unreal. I agreed to attend an interview the following week. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt something I had not experienced since leaving the Carter house. Hope. Real hope. Not because my problems were solved. Not because the pain had disappeared. But because I finally understood something important. My life had not ended when they pushed me out the door. It had simply changed direction. What I did not know was that while my future was beginning to improve, the family that had dismissed me so easily was about to learn a lesson they never expected. The following Tuesday, I walked into the consulting firm for my interview carrying a notebook and a confidence I had not felt in years. The office occupied the top floor of a modern building downtown. Large windows overlooked the city skyline. The atmosphere felt professional, organized, and calm. Nobody knew about the accusations. Nobody saw me as a problem. They simply saw my experience, my skills, and my work ethic. By the end of the interview, the hiring manager smiled and shook my hand. "We will be in touch very soon," she said. As I stepped into the elevator, I realized something surprising. For the first time since leaving the Carter family, I was excited about the future. Meanwhile, back at the family business, things continued unraveling. Ryan was spending longer hours trying to manage responsibilities that used to happen quietly in the background. Nathan was frustrated. Margaret was exhausted. Linda, however, seemed strangely calm, at least according to what I later learned. While everyone else scrambled to solve problems, she always seemed ready with an explanation. If an order was delayed, she blamed staffing issues. If a client complained, she blamed changing market conditions. If paperwork disappeared, she blamed simple mistakes. Her explanations always sounded reasonable. That was why people accepted them. That was why nobody looked deeper. A few days later, I stopped by a local coffee shop after running errands. As I waited for my order, I heard a familiar voice. I turned and immediately recognized Sandra Mitchell, the accountant who had occasionally worked with the Carter family business over the years. Sandra had always been kind to me. We exchanged greetings and sat together for a few minutes. The conversation began casually. Then she asked a question that caught me off guard. "Have they resolved that missing money issue yet?" I stared at her. "No." "What?" Sandra frowned. "That is strange." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" She hesitated before answering. The financial records never made sense to me. Suddenly, I was paying very close attention. Sandra lowered her voice. "Several transactions appeared unusual months ago. I mentioned them to Linda. She told me everything had already been reviewed." A cold feeling settled in my chest. "Months ago," Sandra nodded. "Long before you left." For a moment, the busy coffee shop seemed to disappear around me. I remembered every accusation, every suspicious look, every moment they treated me like a criminal without evidence. If Sandra was correct, Questions about the money existed long before anyone pointed fingers at me. Linda had known about them. Yet somehow I became the target. I kept my expression neutral and asked a few more questions. Sandra answered carefully but consistently. The more she spoke, the more concerned I became. Nothing she said proved Linda had done anything wrong, but it suggested she knew far more than she admitted. When we finally said goodbye, I sat alone at my table staring out the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. My thoughts raced. Part of me wanted to call Ryan immediately. Another part remembered the dinner table, the silence, the suitcase, the complete lack of trust. They had not listened when I defended myself. Why would they listen now? So I made a decision. I would not chase anyone. I would not beg people to believe me. If the truth existed, it would eventually reveal itself. That evening, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Ryan. This one was longer. Things have been difficult here. I think we need to talk. I looked at the words for several seconds before setting the phone aside. Somewhere inside the Carter family, doubts were beginning to form. Small at first, barely noticeable, but doubts have a way of growing. And for the first time, someone other than me was starting to question the story Linda had been telling all along. Over the next several days, the distance between me and the Carter family continued to grow, but the distance between them and the truth was shrinking. I received a call from the consulting firm on Thursday morning. They offered me the position. The salary exceeded my expectations. The benefits were excellent. Most importantly, the job came with something I had not felt in a long time: respect. When the hiring manager congratulated me, I sat quietly for a moment after hanging up. Just 2 weeks earlier, I had walked out of a house believing my life was falling apart. Now a completely different future was opening in front of me. Meanwhile, life inside the Carter household was becoming increasingly complicated. Ryan eventually called me instead of sending another message. I stared at the phone before answering. His voice sounded tired. "How have you been?" he asked. It was a strange question, as though we were distant acquaintances instead of a married couple living through a disaster. "I am doing fine," I replied. An awkward silence followed. Then he sighed. "Things here have been difficult." I almost laughed. Difficult. Another harmless word hiding a much larger reality. "What happened?" I asked. Ryan hesitated. "Just problems. Lots of problems." He began describing one issue after another. Missed deadlines, client complaints, scheduling errors, vendor confusion, problems that seemed unrelated until viewed together. As he spoke, I recognized nearly every situation. They were tasks I had quietly managed for years. The funny thing was that nobody had ever considered those responsibilities important. Not until they stopped getting done. "Emily," Ryan finally said, "I did not realize how much you handled." The statement should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me sad, because he was only noticing my value after I was gone. Before I could answer, another voice appeared in the background. "Linda." I could not hear every word, but I heard enough. She sounded irritated, defensive. The moment Ryan mentioned my name, she started talking. When he returned to the phone, his tone had changed. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Something felt wrong. Later that evening, I received another unexpected call. This time it was Nathan. My father-in-law rarely contacted me directly. In 6 years, I could count our private conversations on one hand. "Emily," he said quietly, "I wanted to ask you something." There was hesitation in his voice. Doubt. The kind that appears when someone starts questioning their own assumptions. He explained that he had been reviewing old business records after several recent mistakes. While searching through archive files, he discovered discrepancies dating back almost 8 months. 8 months. Long before anyone accused me of anything. Long before that terrible dinner. My pulse quickened. "What kind of discrepancies?" I asked. Nathan lowered his voice. "Transactions. Transfers. Missing documentation." The same concerns Sandra had mentioned at the coffee shop. Suddenly the pieces began fitting together. Not completely, but enough to form a pattern. Nathan continued. "Some of these records should have been reviewed a long time ago. I already knew who had been responsible for reviewing them. Linda." After we ended the call, I sat alone in my apartment staring out the window. Streetlights reflected off the pavement below. Cars passed through the intersection. Somewhere across town, a family that had confidently judged me was beginning to realize they might have made a terrible mistake. Yet the truth still remained hidden. Nobody had proof. Nobody had answers. Only growing suspicion. The next morning, as I prepared for my first day at the new job, my phone buzzed again. A message from Margaret. My mother-in-law had not contacted me once since the night I left. The text contained only a single sentence. Emily, I think we need to talk about Linda. For the first time since walking out that front door, I realized someone inside that family was finally starting to see what I had seen all along. My first week at the consulting firm passed faster than I expected. Every morning, I walked into an office where people trusted me to do my job. Every evening, I returned home feeling valued instead of questioned. The contrast was impossible to ignore. For years, I had spent so much energy proving myself to the Carter family that I forgot what normal respect felt like. Yet, even as my new life began taking shape, part of my mind remained focused on the growing cracks inside the family I had left behind. Margaret's message stayed with me throughout the day. I think we need to talk about Linda. It was the first time my mother-in-law had shown even a hint of doubt. By Friday evening, curiosity finally overcame hesitation. We agreed to meet at a small diner halfway between my apartment and the Carter house. The place was quiet. Soft music played overhead. A few customers sat scattered throughout the dining room. When Margaret walked through the door, she looked older than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. Her shoulders seemed heavier. Her smile looked forced. For several seconds, we simply looked at each other. Then she sat down across from me. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. I nodded but said nothing. Margaret stared at her coffee cup before finally speaking. "I owe you an apology." Hearing those words from her felt almost surreal. For weeks I had replayed that dinner in my mind. The accusations, the silence, the suitcase waiting by the door. Yet now the woman who helped push me out was struggling to meet my eyes. "What changed?" I asked. Margaret took a deep breath. "Nathan found something." My attention sharpened immediately. She explained that Nathan had continued reviewing old financial records after discovering the discrepancies. What began as a simple review quickly turned into something much larger. Missing documents, incomplete reports, transactions that should have been explained but were not. The deeper he looked, the more questions appeared. And nearly every question led back to the same person, Linda. "We still do not know exactly what happened," Margaret admitted. "But we know one thing." She finally looked directly at me. "You should never have been blamed." Those words hit harder than I expected. Not because they erased the pain. They did not. But because someone had finally spoken the truth out loud. For weeks, everyone treated suspicion as evidence. Now the foundation of that belief was crumbling. Margaret continued. "Ryan has been looking through emails and archived records. He found something yesterday." My pulse quickened. "What?" She reached into her purse and carefully removed a folded piece of paper. It was a printed email. Linda had sent it nearly 7 months earlier. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Then I noticed the attachment referenced in the message. A financial report. One that had supposedly never existed. One connected to the same missing funds everyone blamed on me. "Ryan found it in an old backup folder," Margaret explained. "The report was reviewed by Linda months before anyone accused you." I stared at the paper. Suddenly, Sandra's comments at the coffee shop made perfect sense. Linda knew there were financial concerns long before that family dinner. She knew questions existed. Yet somehow she directed every suspicion toward me. Margaret folded her hands tightly together. "The more we learn, the worse this looks." I could hear genuine regret in her voice. Real regret. Not for losing a convenient helper. Not for the business problems. Regret for what they had done. As our conversation ended, Margaret quietly asked a question. "If we discover the full truth, would you be willing to speak with the family?" I thought about Ryan. About Nathan. About the years I invested in those relationships. Then I remembered the suitcase waiting beside the door before I even arrived home that night. "That depends on what happens next," I answered. Margaret nodded slowly. Neither of us realized that within a matter of days, Ryan would uncover the piece of evidence that changed everything. 3 days after my conversation with Margaret, everything changed. I was finishing a project review at work when my phone vibrated repeatedly. Across my desk, 5 missed calls. 2 from Ryan. 1 from Margaret. 2 from Nathan. My stomach tightened immediately. Something significant had happened. During my lunch break, I stepped outside and called Ryan back. He answered on the first ring. His voice sounded different. Not tired. Not uncertain. Shocked. "Emily," he said, "we found it." For a moment, I did not know what he meant. Then I heard the emotion in his voice. The truth. They had finally found the truth. Ryan explained that he had spent the previous weekend reviewing archived computer files connected to the family business. What began as a simple search turned into a discovery nobody expected. Hidden inside an old storage folder was a collection of financial records that had never been included in the official reports. Some documents had been renamed. Others had been moved into locations where nobody would normally look. The deeper Ryan searched, the clearer the pattern became. Certain transactions were intentionally concealed. Certain reports were modified after being reviewed. And every digital trail pointed toward the same person, Linda. I sat silently on a bench outside my office building while Ryan spoke. Cars passed along the street. People walked by carrying coffee and briefcases. Yet everything around me faded into the background. For weeks, I had been carrying the weight of accusations that never belonged to me. Now the evidence was finally speaking for itself. There is more, Ryan said quietly. His voice cracked slightly. The original report Sandra flagged months ago was never missing. I closed my eyes. Linda had it. Yes. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Ryan said something I never expected to hear. I should have trusted you. Simple words. Honest words. But they arrived weeks too late. Ryan continued explaining what happened after the discovery. Nathan confronted Linda with the documents. At first she denied everything. Then she blamed confusion. Then misunderstandings. Then bookkeeping errors. Each explanation collapsed when additional records appeared. The more evidence surfaced, the less anyone believed her. By the end of the conversation, even Margaret could no longer defend her daughter. For the first time, the entire family was looking at the situation without assumptions, without excuses, without convenient stories. And the truth was impossible to ignore. After ending the call, I remained on the bench for a long time. I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt tired. Tired of the accusations. Tired of the damage. Tired of remembering that dinner table and the suitcase waiting by the door before anyone even spoke to me. The truth did not erase those memories. Later that evening, Margaret called. Unlike our previous conversation, she did not hesitate. Emily, she said, her voice trembling, we were wrong. Hearing those words from my mother-in-law carried a weight I cannot fully describe. She admitted everything. They acted on suspicion instead of facts. They listened to the loudest voice instead of the most trustworthy one. They chose convenience over fairness. I failed you, she said quietly. And I am deeply sorry. I thanked her for the apology, but part of me remained guarded. Apologies matter. Accountability matters. Yet neither can undo what already happened. Before ending the call, Margaret revealed something unexpected. Nathan wanted a family meeting. Ryan wanted one too. They were determined to make things right. I stared out the apartment window after hanging up. The city lights shimmered against the evening sky. 1 month earlier, I left their house carrying a suitcase and a broken heart. Now the people who sent me away were finally facing the consequences of their decisions. And for the first time since that terrible night, they understood exactly who they should have believed from the beginning. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday afternoon. Ryan called twice before then. Nathan called once. Margaret sent 3 messages. I answered none of them. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted them to suffer. I simply needed time. For nearly a month, I had been forced to rebuild my life while carrying the weight of accusations I never deserved. Now that the truth had finally emerged, everyone suddenly wanted a conversation. The timing was difficult to ignore. On Friday evening, as I finished work and prepared to leave the office, I noticed a familiar vehicle parked across the street. My heart skipped for a moment. It was Nathan's truck. Beside it stood Ryan and Margaret. None of them approached the building. None of them came inside. They simply waited. Part of me considered leaving through another exit. Instead, I walked outside. The moment they saw me, all 3 stood up. Nobody smiled. Nobody attempted small talk. The atmosphere felt completely different from the confidence they displayed during that dinner a month earlier. Ryan looked exhausted. Margaret's eyes were red. Nathan seemed older somehow. We stood facing each other in silence for several seconds. Finally, Nathan spoke. Emily, thank you for coming out. I nodded politely, but remained cautious. Nathan took a deep breath. I spent 30 years building our business. I always believed I could recognize honesty when I saw it. He looked down briefly. I was wrong. Hearing those words from him carried enormous weight. Nathan was not a man who apologized easily. In all the years I had known him, I could remember only a handful of occasions when he admitted a mistake. Yet here he was, Ryan stepped forward next. I failed you. His voice cracked slightly. You asked me to trust you, and I did not. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I remembered every unanswered question from that night. Every opportunity, he had to defend me. Every moment, he chose silence instead. Some wounds take longer to heal than others. Margaret wiped her eyes before speaking. When you joined this family, you brought stability into our lives. You cared about all of us. And when accusations appeared, I chose fear instead of fairness. She paused. I am deeply ashamed of that. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. Yet something inside me remained guarded. Trust is not restored the moment an apology arrives. Trust is rebuilt through actions. Nathan then handed me a folder. Inside were copies of the financial records, email chains, and audit findings that exposed the truth. They wanted me to see everything for myself. No excuses. No edited version. No attempt to minimize what happened. The evidence was overwhelming. As I turned the pages, I finally understood why they looked so devastated. They were not only facing Linda's deception, they were facing their own decisions. The realization that they had condemned the wrong person. Ryan quietly cleared his throat. There is something else. I looked up. What? He exchanged a glance with Nathan before answering. The entire family will be gathering tomorrow. My stomach tightened slightly. Why? Ryan's eyes met mine. Because there are people who owe you the truth. And people who owe you an apology. As I closed the folder, I realized something had shifted. A month ago, I left their house feeling powerless. Now the people who once judged me were asking for a chance to be heard. And for the first time since this nightmare began, they were the ones waiting for my decision. The family gathering took place on Sunday afternoon. Exactly 4 weeks had passed since the night I walked out carrying that suitcase. As I drove toward the Carter house, I could not stop thinking about how much had changed in such a short time. A month earlier, I arrived at this property believing it was my home. Then I left as an outsider. Now I was returning under circumstances nobody could have imagined. The driveway was full when I arrived. Cars lined both sides of the street. Relatives who rarely attended family events were there. Cousins, aunts, uncles, even a few close family friends. News of the truth had spread quickly. People wanted answers. More importantly, they wanted accountability. I sat in my car for a moment before stepping outside. My heart beat faster than I expected. Not because I was afraid. Because I knew this day represented something much larger than an apology. It represented the moment everyone would finally confront the consequences of their choices. The front door opened before I reached it. Nathan greeted me first. His expression was serious but warm. Margaret stood beside him. Ryan waited just behind them. Nobody spoke immediately. Then Margaret quietly said, "Thank you for coming." I nodded and stepped inside. The atmosphere felt completely different from the dinner that changed everything. A month ago, the room felt cold and judgmental. Today, it felt heavy with regret. Conversations stopped as I entered. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked ashamed. A few seemed genuinely emotional. Nathan guided everyone into the living room. Chairs had been arranged in a large circle. Nobody sat at the head. Nobody occupied a position of authority. For the first time, everyone appeared equal. Nathan stood and cleared his throat. Before anything else, he began, there are some things that need to be said publicly. The room became silent. He spoke about the investigation, the records, the emails, the evidence. He explained how assumptions replaced facts, how suspicion became certainty without proof. Most importantly, he acknowledged that the family had failed me. Every word echoed through the room. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Nobody offered excuses. Then Margaret stood. Tears filled her eyes as she addressed the family. She described all the ways I had supported them over the years. The birthdays I organized. The business responsibilities I managed. The appointments I scheduled. The countless problems I solved before anyone else even noticed them. We stopped appreciating what Emily did because she made everything look easy, Margaret said. Several relatives lowered their heads. Ryan spoke next. His apology was simple, honest, direct. He admitted that a husband should have trusted his wife before trusting rumors. He admitted that silence can be just as damaging as accusations. Listening to him was painful, yet I could tell he meant every word. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, family members began speaking. Some apologized for believing gossip. Others admitted they never questioned the accusations because it felt easier to follow the crowd. Several confessed they regretted not contacting me after I left. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Nobody wanted to be responsible, yet everyone had contributed in some way. By the end of the afternoon, the room felt emotionally exhausted. The truth had broken through every excuse, every justification, every convenient story people told themselves. As the final apology ended, complete silence filled the room. Dozens of faces looked toward me, waiting, hoping, wondering what I would say next. And for the first time since that terrible night, the entire family understood that the future of those relationships was no longer their decision. It was mine. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The room remained completely silent as dozens of family members waited for my response. A month earlier, I would have given almost anything to hear the words they had just spoken. The apologies, the admissions, the acknowledgement that I had been wronged. Yet standing there now, I realized something important. The last month had changed me. Not because I became stronger than before, because I finally learned my worth did not depend on their approval. I looked around the room slowly. At Ryan, at Margaret, at Nathan, at relatives who avoided my calls, at people who believed accusations without evidence. Some could not meet my eyes. Others looked as though they were holding their breath. Finally, I spoke. I appreciate the apologies. My voice remained calm, steady, and I believe most of them are sincere. Several people visibly relaxed. But I was not finished. However, forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. The room became quiet again. When I needed trust, nobody offered it. When I needed someone to ask questions, nobody did. The decision had already been made before I even sat down at that dinner table. I saw tears forming in Margaret's eyes. Ryan lowered his head. Nathan remained completely still. You did not throw me out because of evidence, I continued. You threw me out because it was easier than challenging the story you were told. Nobody disagreed. Nobody could, because they knew it was true. Then I said something I had been thinking about for days. I forgive you. Several people looked relieved immediately. But again, I was not finished. I forgive you because carrying anger only hurts the person carrying it. I do not want to spend the rest of my life trapped in what happened. Margaret covered her mouth as tears rolled down her cheeks. Ryan looked as though he could barely speak. But forgiveness does not erase consequences. Every word landed heavily inside the room. Trust has to be rebuilt. Relationships have to be rebuilt. And some things will never return to exactly what they were before. That was the truth. Not the dramatic truth people expect in movies. The real truth. Once trust is broken, rebuilding it takes time. Sometimes years. Sometimes longer. Ryan finally stood and walked toward me. He stopped a few feet away. Not close enough to assume forgiveness. Not far enough to appear distant. I understand, he said quietly. And for the first time in weeks, I believed him. Nathan nodded slowly. Margaret wiped away tears and whispered, "We will earn it." The gathering slowly ended after that. Family members approached one by one. Some offered additional apologies. Others simply thanked me for coming. Nobody pressured me. Nobody demanded immediate answers. The atmosphere felt completely different from the family I remembered. As the afternoon faded into evening, I walked back toward my car. Ryan followed me outside. The autumn air felt cool against my face. Fallen leaves moved across the driveway. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan looked at me and asked the question everyone had been wondering. Will you ever come home? I smiled sadly. Home. The word carried a different meaning now. I looked back at the house where so much had happened. The place where I spent 6 years trying to prove I belonged. Then I thought about my apartment. My new career. My new beginning. I do not know what the future looks like, I answered honestly. But I know I am not the same person who left here a month ago. Ryan nodded slowly. He understood. As I drove away that evening, I did not feel anger. I did not feel bitterness. I felt peace. The family that once pushed me away had finally learned the truth. They learned that loyalty should never be questioned without reason. They learned that trust is fragile. And they learned that sometimes the person they value the least is the person holding everything together. Most importantly, I learned something too. Losing the life I thought I wanted gave me the chance to build the life I deserved.